next up, we have a session on funding. And we're going to hear for some really interesting perspectives on funding. So I hope we're going to build off some of the calls for funding that we may have heard from Dave and Salma, and some of the perspectives on funding from Kath as somebody in it. And our moderator is Nessa Kenny. And Nessa is the Associate Program Director for the Peace and Recovery Program at Innovations for Poverty Action, where she leads 2 research grant-making portfolios, one broadly on conflict, violence, and displacement, and one focused on displaced livelihoods. She works with civil society organizations, governments, and academics to ensure that evidence informs policy and practice. So with that, I'd like to invite Nessa on stage along with her panelists.
Great. Thank you so much, Evan. Yes, as Evan said, I'm Nessa Kenny. I'm the Associate Director of the Peace and Recovery Program at IPA, where I oversee research and grant making on peace, conflict, and displacement. And it's my pleasure today to welcome you all to our panel on innovations for peace financing. Dovetailing with the theme for today, I think a hard truth is that the field is grappling with at the moment is that the landscape of peace funding is changing quite quickly. Many bilateral donors that have traditionally anchored some of the largest peace investments are substantially reducing their budgets. And at the same time, some of the new capital flowing into development emphasizes measurable impact and cost effectiveness per dollar spent. We just had a panel that spoke a lot about that. Peace building, I think, sits somewhat uncomfortably between these trends. Building peace, of course, requires long-term commitments, which are, of course, harder when funding is scarce. It requires operating in really complex, ever-changing contexts, which we've heard a lot about today. And its ultimate aims, things like social cohesion, violence reduction, conflict reduction, are genuinely hard to measure, though I do think we're getting better at that. I think many of us are here today because we believe that behavioral science has genuine insights to offer peace building, from understanding prejudice reduction to testing what shifts social norms, going back to Betsy's talk earlier today. That said, the peace building community, in my view, has been understandably cautious about whether or not findings from the social sciences can translate across vastly different contexts, or whether experimental methods are appropriate for peace building. This tension, I think, personally drives a lot of my work and leaves the field with a question of whether and how we generate and use evidence in a way that both respects peace building's complexity and at the same time makes a case for investment from a wide variety of funders. And so today's panel brings together some of these funders that are navigating tensions that we just discussed in different ways, from bilateral aid to private philanthropy to an innovative funder-doer model. We'll explore what's driving current dynamics, how research can influence funding decisions, and what innovative approaches might pave some kind of path forward. Let me introduce the panelists, though briefly. I hope they don't take offense to the short introductions in favor of more time for discussion. Håvard Nygård is Director of Knowledge and Innovation at NORAD, which is the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation. Leslie Wingender is the Senior Portfolio Director of Peacebuilding at Humanity United, and Zezhen Wu is a core member and behavioral scientist at the agency fund. I thought we'd start by taking a step back and try to understand the environment that we're in at the moment. Håvard, maybe we'll start with you. We've obviously seen peacebuilding expenditure decline over the last decade and decline quite precipitously in the last year as ODA, Global Overseas Development Assistance, dropped substantially in 2025. That said, Norway seems to be sort of stepping up, or at least not retreating as other donors do, maintaining your 1% ODA commitment and maintaining a focus on peace as a core part of your work. NORAD's annual conference that happened last week was entirely focused on peace. And you also personally have been on a few different sides of this conversation, both as a conflict researcher in sort of a previous world that you worked in, and now leading knowledge and innovation for a bilateral. So I'm curious, from that vantage point, can you walk us through what's driving these cuts to peace funding in general at bilateral agencies, and what you think the case for peace funding is that works in Norway that might not be working as well or landing as well elsewhere?
Yes, thank you so much, Nessa. It's so good to be with all of you for this amazing panel. Although it's a little bit late in Norway, you can see it's dark out the window, but good to see you. Yeah, so I think it's a question that a lot of people are grappling with right now, Nessa. We have seen, the deepest cuts to development assistance broadly since the end of the Cold War. I guess the jury is still out on exactly how big the cuts are going to be, but maybe, in the vicinity of 30% cut from 2023 to 2026. And that's dramatic. I think it's also important to appreciate that although the cuts to US funding in absolute terms is driving a lot of this, it's much broader than that, right? A lot of funders are making deep cuts. A lot of European funders, a lot of funders that used to be leading the pack really in development funding broadly, and also in peace funding specifically, like our Swedish neighbors, like Germany, like France, like the UK, are making deep and painful cuts to their development assistance. And I don't think we've seen we're not around the corner or anything yet. There might still be cuts this year, and it will have, obviously dramatic consequences. I think we'll be discussing and debating for quite a long time why we're seeing these deep cuts. But I think there's, a few reasons obviously stand out already, although they vary a bit from donor to donor. Obviously, for a lot of European donors in particular, it is explicitly done as a trade-off to defense spending, right? So we've seen now multiple governments that are basically saying we have to increase defense spending. The only way to do that is to cut development spending. I think that the trade-off is unfortunate, but it's definitely understandable. But I think there's a deeper story to that, right? I'm worried, let's use that word, that we as the development community more broadly haven't really been able to explain to the public what development assistance broadly and peace building more specifically is actually achieving. We've told a lot of good stories, and there's been an amazing lot of good research done, but we haven't really been able to explain and convince the public why we're spending taxpayer money abroad. And that's what we're doing, right? We're spending taxpayer money abroad, and I think we need to explain to taxpayers why we do that, and we need to explain what we're achieving with that money. We've seen now, so there's been multiple surveys in the Scandinavian countries. Nora did a survey just a couple of months ago that basically shows this picture, right? That people, overall, there's actually quite a lot of overall support for development spending, but people don't really think it produces any results. So it's a nice thing to do. If it's only a nice thing to do, then that's the first thing you cut when you have to make cuts. So we really have to do a much better job at explaining to people what this funding is achieving, that it is effective, that you can do not just cost-effective development spending, but cost-effective peace programming. And that we're doing this, obviously for solidarity reasons, but also because we have a common interest in peace and stability in the world. And at the end of the day, if we can prevent, so one of the things, for instance, we discussed at the NORAD conference last week, is a simple case that if we're able to prevent a conflict, that's vastly much more cost effective than having to respond with humanitarian aid, which is basically the modus operandi now after the fact. But it's still the case also in Norway, which is keeping 1% spending. It's still the case that we invest quite little, quite small amounts in prevention. And even though peace and peace building is a relatively bigger share in Norwegian development spending, we could probably do a better job. But for Norway, a lot of our development priorities have been driven really by our peace and reconciliation efforts around the world. So I think from Norway's perspective, it's always been a little bit easier to see the link between development broadly and peace building more specifically. Thank you.
That's well taken. Yeah, thank you so much, Håvard. I think you hit the nail on the head in saying that we have not, as a field, necessarily been great at explaining what peace building funding is achieving. And Leslie, I guess that landscape analysis by Håvard raises the question of how funders outside of the bilateral system are thinking about this. And Humanity United is a private foundation that's been investing in peace building and peace for a very long time, when other philanthropic capital or bilateral capital also often flows to areas with clearer metrics. And so maybe precisely to Håvard's sort of explanation of us not being maybe great at being advocates for this, how do you make the case, both internally and externally, for these investments when impact might be hard to quantify?
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Nessa, for the question. And I'm excited to be a part of this panel. What I want to bring is what's so interesting is each of us represents different funding institutions. And I think that is exactly the thing that is missing as part of this conversation around impact, is because we only see it from either like one intervention. And as peace builders, we know that even if it's the most effective intervention, it's a more complex situation, and there could be a structural issue that also needs to be addressed at the same time as the community fissures are being addressed, right? And so at Humanity United, so we are a philanthropic organization based in the United States, and our mission is to support transforming violent systems into systems of peace and freedom and justice for all. One of the great privileges I have is I have a founder who believes in this mission as well and has given the organization the aperture and the breadth to really explore what that looks like. We have, as a philanthropic organization, gone through many strategies, as many, if anyone has worked with a philanthropy or with a funder, know. But as part of that process, we have shifted from dashboards and indicators to discussions on learning questions with our board, talking about adaptations, signals that we're seeing in the field, and what that means and how our funding is relative to other funding and other efforts. So we take a systems view, which is also something that's important for our field. And Kath, just previous to this panel, was talking about systems funding and thinking about it that way. Right now, I think there's been a trend among donors to align funding. Our model right now is like a multi-donor fund. I think that is one model, and we need to keep exploring other creative ways of aligning funding, maybe not putting our funds all in the same pot. That might actually create more challenges for getting it out, but thinking it rather as complementary funding. So as a philanthropy, I remember when I first joined, I've been working in implementing organizations with grassroots organizations. So joining a philanthropy, I remember when I found out our grant sizes were much smaller than a USAID $6 million program. We were giving grants of $50,000, for example. And so that I asked the question, well, what is really catalytic of a 50,000 grant, for example? And what is never covered in bigger programs is the opportunity to come together, reflect, and adapt as practitioners. We're go. We're in very hard situations. We're with community members. When do we have the time and space to come out for that moment and reflect on how do we adapt in this situation, et cetera? So that was one place where I found Humanity United has a financial mechanism that can support learning opportunities. We're more flexible in that sense. I know my colleagues formerly at USAID were not able to carve out that space within a program. So we could come in and support in that way for critical reflection, seeing ourselves as one piece of a broader ecosystem, trying to address issues either regionally or in our practice as peace building, really building that. So I think the question, the last thing I'd say is thinking about relationships and networks, and that we need to move from this discussion on what's effective to how do we effectively work together, and how do we leverage each other's strengths and step in where there's a gap, like a weakness, or there's a limit in funding. There's certain funding that we're a U.S. philanthropy, so we're going to be under U.S. tax law, but we can do some really creative things. And then we have other funders who are based in other countries who aren't under that same restriction. So how do we work together to jointly support the critical work that's happening?
Thank you, Leslie. Yeah, it sounds like Humanity United is really thoughtful about sort of your positioning and where you think the dollars that you invest can make the most difference. Zezhen, maybe over to you. The agency fund operates quite differently from both bilateral agencies, of course, and traditional philanthropy, as both a funder and an implementer. And so I'm curious if you can speak to a little bit about what that model has taught you about supporting complex, hard to measure work, and what you see in terms of lessons that there might be that could apply to peace funding, kind of as an outsider looking into this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Happy to join this panel and learn from everyone. So at the agency fund, we operate as what we call a funder and doer. So we fund and work with promising NGOs to advance human agency. And our funding practice is guided by 4 pillars: evidence, scale, agency, and learning. And together they've taught us like important lessons that I think would travel across contexts. So first, evidence. We care deeply about causal evidence, or at least serious attempts to get at causality. That can mean large randomized control trials, but more often it means learning rigorously through pre-post tests, quasi-experimental designs, natural experiments, A/B experiments embedded in real programs. So the second part is scale. We are interested in whether organizations are generally trying to reach scale, for example, a million frontline workers or beneficiaries by 2030. And the third and most distinctive for us is the agency pillar. So rather than funding a specific domain, outcome, or issue area, or like health or education, we treat agency as the organizing theme for our funding. So by agency, we mean the human capability to make choices for their own lives and to actually realize those choices under constraints. So the agency fund was funded out of the evidence movement in economics, where many funders and researchers were focused on identifying cost-effective programs. So Richard Seidelmeyer, our co-founder, noticed something striking. Highly cost-effective programs, whether in education, health, or livelihoods, often include well-tailored coaching, counseling, or tools that enable people to unlock outcomes for themselves and those around them. And with recent advances in technology and generative AI, offering new opportunities for scale, so we sort of set out to test our hypothesis that the vast reserves of human potential can be practically and cost-effectively tapped through approaches that activate human agency. And then the fourth pillar is learning. So we want to build what we call learning organizations, ones that treat both success and failure as data points. So that is often actualized through building data warehouse, extract, transform, load data pipelines that are sort of standard in the tech industry, rapid iteration, A/B experiments, and embedding evaluation directly into product and program cycles. So over time, this builds an evidence-based mindset, not just an evidence-based report at the end of the program. And I think the agency piece is specifically insightful or potentially relevant to peace funding. So let me offer some examples on how we think about this agency, both as the funding thesis and how we actualize our work with the NGOs. So there are 2 angles. One is on intervention and one is on measurement. So on the intervention side, one example that we fund is what social psychologists call psychologically wise interventions. So things like growth mindset, values affirmation, perspective taking, social norms intervention, right? So these interventions help people make meaning in their immediate environment and also fulfill their fundamental psychological needs, namely the need to understand, the need to belong, and also the need for self-integrity. And then on the measurement side, we take seriously the fact that agency is complex and multifaceted. So we tend to distinguish between internally facing agency, more subjective forms of agency, like beliefs or mental models or self-efficacy, coming from like the social psychological literature. And there is a form of externally expressed agency, how people set goals, navigate the obstacles, and persist and learn through difficulties. And that sort of comes from the economic literature about capabilities approach, right? And we realized that there are rich quantitative and qualitative ways to measure both dimensions. And recently, I've been set out to establish this initiative called Human Agency and AI Lab, where we study how we can use large language models and generative AI as measurement tools to capture constructs like agency out of naturalistic data when humans interact with AI, or as students submit like videos or audios or images through their programs. So the key lesson for us has been that there's real science here, and even for construct as abstract as agency, we can generate evidence through thoughtful intervention design and careful measurement. And this is where I think the connection to peace funding becomes somewhat compelling. So in crisis and conflict-affected context, Peace, like in my opinion, much like agency, is a higher order individual and collective construct that reviews itself through everyday and observable signals, right? It shows up in when people trust institutions and each other enough to engage, where they feel safe exercising their voice and participating in decisions, where communities can manage like disagreement without violence, right? So these dynamics change very slowly, as I understand, but are also like shaped by many forces at once. So there are scientific ways, especially from other domains actually, to meaningfully track through patterns in behavior and narratives and decision-making over time, especially with the help of today's AI technology. So I guess I will sort of end my spiel with a question for the room actually. So could a construct like agency serve as a funding thesis for peace, not just as an outcome to be achieved, but also as a core capability to be built, measured, and learned from over time?
Thank you so much, Zezhen. And I actually think that dovetails quite well with the next question that I'd hope to ask Håvard and Leslie. I think overall this conference is about what behavioral science can contribute to peace, but of course research only matters if it drives decision making. Zezhen talked, of course, about how they use evidence as one of their pillars to guide their granting and also produce evidence through their work through learning. Håvard and Leslie, I'm curious how your organizations use evidence and research, including from behavioral science, but maybe not necessarily restricted to that, to inform the investments you make. So where do you also see maybe the biggest gaps, either in the research itself or how it reaches practitioners or funding organizations like yours? Leslie, maybe I'll start with you this time.
Great. It's a good question. So I think, so at Humanity United on the peace building team, we're constantly reading in conversation on different trends in peace building. I think what's interesting about research is, well, one, there's research and then there's learning from specific interventions. And we are in a relationship with our grantee partners to explore what did they learn, what they set out to do, what adapted, those types of conversations, which often in other funding situations aren't the norm, I think is a priority that we have first and foremost, is to learn alongside our organizations. We take an accompaniment approach, which is like, it comes from the word in Spanish in Colombia, like acompañar, to really walk alongside our partners and learn with them. And that's because different pieces of organizational issues or models that they're operating in or the context give us clues into what actually helps us then shift other funding priorities or opportunities to partner with other organizations, so we can really get at this more holistic approach to any situation where we're more invested. So for research, I was actually having this conversation with the team at IPA on the Peace and Recovery after another panel, where it was fascinating to hear about the different rounds of funding that were going out. And I wanted to have a learning circle with those who were picked, those who are doing the work, to really reflect on what does this mean? What's coming out of this, instead of reading it just in I like it in the form, I like the long form, but like, what's the conversation around it, and how do we pull from that in order to inform my understanding and what partners need to be hearing about this? I do remember using a really important study on social cohesion in Sierra Leone from IPA with Fumble Talk. And that learning was very important for discussions I was having with Colombian partners as we were considering the Truth Commission design outcome, ways to support psychosocial as part of those conversations. So it's been more of an I find it very, as a movement, I would like to see more of an integration with academics and different circles of funders, academics and partners, and not just funders, and like bringing in partners so they hear this, because this is the work they've been doing that they can have pushback on, or they can provide. It's going to bring up questions on, oh, that wouldn't work here in Colombia because of X, Y, and Z, but it makes me think that we could do it this way. And I think those are the generative conversations based on research that would really help our field.
Håvard, maybe over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nessa. So I agree with everything Leslie said. I think she made some really good points. I think I'll just add that, so NORAD isn't a implementing agency. We work with a range of partners. So for us, number one priority is really to ensure that our partners have the capabilities and the systems, and really also the incentives sometimes from our side. To be evidence-based in their programming, and that's going to look pretty different for different partners, right? So it looks very different if you're working with a small and nimble NGO versus when you're doing working with the World Bank or UN agency, and that again is different from working directly with national governments. One of the things you can do from a development agency is also to build capacity in developing country governments themselves to use evidence, to use cost-effectiveness evidence, to be able to make more evidence-based decision makings, which is really one of the things that I think is probably among the most cost-effective things we can do. But internally, from NORAD's perspective, it is. We're a bureaucracy. So that means at the end of the day, making evidence-based decisions means, it comes down to things like you need to have policy in place. You need to have regulation. You need to care very deeply, much more deeply than I ever thought I would do, about what a call for proposal looks like. What are we asking for? What are the guidelines? What are the requirements? But we are also, we have a portfolio approach to all our grant management, and for all our portfolios that are thematically defined most of the time, we develop knowledge and learning plans, and that has been extremely useful for us also to get away from this simplistic indicator view of the world, but to actually be able to have teams that sit together and really think through what is the theory of change here, what do I know, what are the knowledge gaps, what new data do I need, what new evidence do I need to invest in to check and see if my theory of change actually holds up. What do I need to know if I'm on track, if I'm making a difference, and what data would you have to change course if you needed to. And we try to build a learning cycle around that, and really put evidence at the heart of that, rigorous evidence, causal evidence, but also evidence more broadly, basically.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense, and maybe actually that dovetails well. So it sounds like from both Leslie, you and you, Håvard, it seems like there is this belief in sort of accompanying the folks that you work with in order to think about how to do the work, to learn from the programs that you're implementing, to walk with them through the process of learning about what does work and maybe what doesn't. Zezhen, maybe that dovetails quite well to what I think is one of the core tenets of the agency fund as you described it, and that is helping organizations become learning organizations, in part, as I understand it, through iterative experimentation. I'm curious, could you walk us through what that takes as an organization, and maybe what gets in the way, and how in that process you balance a push towards rigor, but also a recognition of complexity, both in terms of the types of programs that are implemented, but also in the behavior change that you want to see.
Yeah, definitely. So by learning organization, we mean that organizations need to continuously integrate learning into how they operate, and rather than treating evaluation as a one-off thing that they just do it once and forget about it, right? So a learning organization, by our definition, is routinely analyzes operational data and experiments to understand how its services affect people's experiences and outcomes, and translate those insights into hypotheses for improvement, and then test them through rapid cycles of iterations, and then adapts and scales what works. So let me give an example of an NGO that I personally work with, which is Neuro Health. So they operate in health systems in South Asia, especially in rural settings. So Neuro operates in a blended model. They train the nurses and practitioners in hospitals using a train-the-trainer model. to deliver in-person trainings to the patients. And then after the patients are discharged, they opt into a WhatsApp-based system that connects them with medical professionals for continued support on health. And most recently, they were also involved in our generative AI accelerator to develop an AI co-pilot for the medical professionals to provide additional support to their patient interactions. So what makes Neuro a learning organization is that learning is embedded across both the digital and in-person parts of the program. So on the digital part of the program, we work with Neuro to turn the WhatsApp chatbot into an experimentation platform. So with thousands of researcher-designed messages, so I actually personally help them, using the intervention mapping framework from behavioral science to guide how they think about behavioral determinants that will change the user's behavior. And then what are the right behavioral change techniques that are matched in changing this behavioral determinant? And then what are the parameters for effectiveness that would ensure that this behavioral change technique work on this behavioral determinant within this WhatsApp setting, right? And then we help them formulate clear A/B testing hypotheses, such as which behavioral nudge increase willingness to engage in kangaroo mother care content in a YouTube video, right? And systematically test message variants in these online A/B experiments. And also because there is a functional data warehouse that we collaborated with them on, that always collects these engagement and meaningful engagement outcomes, we can easily test new variants and ideas in a rapid format. And at the same time, the same learning logic applies to their in-person program, although it usually takes a lot more time to do like field experiments, even in a smaller scale. So recently, we actually ran a social norms embedded redesign of their materials that the nurses use. So they use flip charts to do this sort of education session with patients. There are posters on the wall. There are also take-home pamphlets, right? So highlighting, for example, that most mothers in Karnataka believe skin-to-skin care, kangaroo mother care, is beneficial to their baby. So we actually did a social norms survey to get the actual number, put that into a design of these materials, and we used pre-post design across hospitals. We observed roughly a threefold increase in mothers' awareness and actual practice of kangaroo mother care 30 days after discharge, comparing the treatment group with the control group. So this is sort of unprecedented within the history of the organization, right? And this also tells us about how to place like behavioral science sort of in this learning organization journey. And I think that's also how we generally like balance rigor and complexity. So we use experimental and the qualitative experimental methods to get insights about program improvement. And what often gets in the way is not like lack of tools, but lack of time and data infrastructure and incentives to learn. So I think that's why us like as funders matter so much here, like supporting learning organizations, meaning funding the capability and the capacity to explore, to test, to adapt, and to scale, and to create the agency of the NGO practitioners rather than just demanding like comparable metrics or outputs upfront.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Zezhen. And I think your point about how this all takes a lot of time, I think maybe informs an observation I have about the peace building space generally. And I think in my view, the field has been somewhat slow to integrate insights from impact evaluations or behavioral science or social psychology on issues like prejudice reduction or intergroup contact, and somewhat reticent, honestly, of conducting impact evaluations or behavioral science research. And I think we've been kind of dancing around a tension, both in this conversation and more broadly today, where there are some new funders in this space or sort of in the development space generally that are influenced often by the effective altruism movement or the credibility revolution, who really want quantifiable, comparable outcomes. But as we've talked about today, peace building outcomes are often very hard to measure. Practitioners have been understandably cautious about this. And so, yeah, Håvard and Leslie, I'm curious how you sort of square that circle. Like, how do you interpret those tensions in the context of thinking about investing peace, and how do you navigate those as funders? Maybe, Håvard, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, sorry, Nessa, your sound actually cut out for me, so I didn't. I missed the middle part of your question. Sorry.
Leslie, did you get the full question? I'm happy to repeat it, but basically, I'm curious, Håvard, what you make of this tension between sort of the push to measure, to experiment, to apply behavioral science or impact evaluations quite rigorously, and just the complexity of peace work generally.
Yeah. Yeah, no. So that's an excellent question. I think it's fair to say that the credibility revolution has come a little bit late to the peace building field. Although there's quite a lot happening right now, and I've seen a big change in the last few years. Just the fact that an organization like the UN Peacebuilding Fund is now actively actually conducting a range of RCTs, I think is very good. But I think it's also from coming from Norway perspective here, this a lot of the peace and reconciliation efforts we've been involved in are they're sensitive, intensely political, very often driven by an opportunity. So just the very thinking of randomizing is alien. But I think that's also now maturing, and people have a much better appreciation of when you're doing that kind of process that is political and is sensitive, and when you're doing a kind of programming that actually lends itself to randomized experimentation or other types of rigorous evidence generation. So I think we'll just have to continue pushing in the direction that we seem to already be moving in.
Leslie, I'm curious what you make of this, because my impression is that Humanity United, at least historically, has come from a bit of a different perspective here, and I'm curious what you would add.
Yeah, thank you. I think as a field, we still think that is the gold standard, and I think there's so much more creative other participatory methods, qualitative work that also exist, and then we don't go back to saying which are the spaces that really work for impact evaluation. Because I do think we've matured in finding spaces that, while not even creative on counterfactuals, creative on creating, planning ahead, ensuring that we're not doing harm by picking a control group, right? And already sequencing a program in a way that you can do that. And I think previously with Mercy Corps, I think that we had a lot of interesting opportunities of learning when we were implementing different programs. Those programs also had broader investments in economic outcomes. And so I think when we think of just peace building, like some of the tenets of peace building and negotiation, or getting to I don't know if that's where the places that this works well. I think our field, we should be able to define that a bit more, because even saying peace building, if we're doing peace building is a small community engagement on collective protection, that to them they wouldn't use the word peace building because it's their livelihoods. But to us, we would categorize it either as peace building or if it's a democracy thing. When you go up the ladders, we're like segregated and or siloed in how we think about it. So I would like to see more of that, and then like creativity of what pieces of some of this work would make sense, and instead of having the debate, which I think is just which is the best methodology to use in a certain situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think what I've heard from both of you just now is that there are some situations where it makes a lot of sense to put a lot of emphasis on both learning that way and applying that kind of evidence. And there are some situations where it just doesn't, because of the intensely political or sensitive nature of some programs. That is very well taken. We are running low on time. And so I'm going to pivot to our final question to look ahead a little bit. So obviously, organizations are thinking at the moment about how to respond to the changes in peace funding. Some are focusing more on localization. Some are experimenting with new models like social impact bonds and blended finance. Others are trying to crowd in new sources of funding from non-traditional donors or donors who haven't traditionally given to peace building as a cause. So Håvard and Leslie, maybe what is one thing that your organizations are doing or would like to do to fund peace differently in this moment? And Zezhen, from the outside looking in, what would make peace work more compelling to a funder like the Agency Fund? Leslie, maybe let's start with you and then go to Håvard and then end on Zezhen.
Yeah, something like ecosystem funding and working together. I think I'd really like a further conversation, and how do we, as funders, anyone in a funding capacity, bring what you can do, what you can't do, the limitations, and sit down together to look with partners who are at a national level, at a regional level, at a local level, like territorial level, for us to discuss this like in multi-levels and like different dimensions. I think I think that is something we're really interested in at AHU. It's how we're bringing our different partners together. It's how we show up, being very transparent about, we are a funder, this is the limits of what we have, or this is what we're bringing, but we are one stakeholder of many in this room. And so our voice is one of many. So how do we, so I'd like that invitation for us as a field to get together across the spectrum.
Yeah, so sorry to be boring, Nessa, but I don't think we're not really doing anything new right now. But what we are doing is we are in the middle of, so this year our government will write a white paper on the future of Norwegian development policy to be presented to Parliament spring next year. And what we are looking for is big new ideas on peace building, on peace funding to put into that white paper. So I don't have anything fresh and new to present to you now, but I would like you to send all your fresh new initiatives and new ways of thinking to me, so I can put it into, or try at least to put it into the white paper to make it future Norwegian policy.
Yeah, and for us, I think our mission is broad but precise, meaning that we want to focus on expanding human agency, and also want to do it through empowering learning organizations, right? But I think will be and likely will be connections with peace funding in general if peace work becomes more compelling when it is explicit about when human capabilities it is trying to build, and when it shows how these capabilities can be strengthened over time. And we would love to work with other funders on how we can be helpful in the sector.
Wonderful. Thank you three very much. I'm sad that that's all we have time for, but I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation. Yeah, thank you very much, Håvard, Leslie, Zezhen, for your candor and insights today. And well taken, Håvard. I think you might receive an influx of ideas of how to fund peace building differently, and big new ideas coming into you as Norway thinks about that white paper.
Beautiful.
Evan, thank you. Over to you.